Hey Adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey Adapters, welcome back. On today's show, we have Seth Schultz and Tom Lewis. Seth is the executive director of the Resilience Shift. Seth is leading work to accelerate the theory and practice of resilience for the critical infrastructure systems that underpin our societies. Tom is a U.S. sector president for WSP, a large global engineering and infrastructure consulting firm. Seth and Tom will share their adaptation journey and how they got to know each other. They give us the scientist's perspective and the engineer's perspective of sustainability and resilience. They introduce us to the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure and how it is bringing the engineering and scientific communities together. Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And so we're going to talk about your journey here. So I'm excited about that too, but we're also going to be talking about all these other subjects that I find exciting. But let's just start off getting a little bit of background. First, Seth, let's start with you. What do you do there at the Resilience Shift?
Yeah, we're a global not-for-profit organization, and we work on bringing awareness to the importance of sustainable and resilient infrastructure, particularly the whole systems thinking perspective and how intertwined today's infrastructure is.
All right, and what about you, Tom? What do you do there at WSP, and maybe a little bit more background?
Yeah, I focus here at WSP on running the part of the U.S. company that focuses on federal clients as well as emergency management clients. Not just federal like FEMA and Army Corps, but all the way down through state, city emergency management agencies, and even commercial sector clients who have needs during disasters and other types of emergencies.
Okay, so part of what we're going to talk about here too is that your journey together. And maybe Seth, you can start us off. You guys have known each other a while and you've kind of had these parallel tracks. Maybe give us a little context of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to start. But no, Tom and I have known each other almost 20 years now. So my career started off in the engineering consultant business, and I was very fortunate to have run into Tom Lewis. He was my boss. He's been one of my favorite bosses I've ever had, and a good mentor at the Lewis Berger Group. And I headed up some environmental services and emergency response work in New York City, and that's how we got to know each other initially. Why Tom was heading up the broader environmental services for the company countrywide.
Okay, Tom, so do you have a different take on all that? Does that sound accurate?
No, that sounds very accurate. And we both got our trial by fire together soon after Seth joined, actually, when the terrorist attacks in the World Trade Center occurred on 9/11. And Lewis Berger at the time, which was later acquired by WSP, but Lewis Berger was asked to not only help with the cleanup of the site, the World Trade Center site, when the towers fell and all the debris and the witch's brew of contaminants that were there, but we also were engaged by other clients, including the medical examiner's office, helping to sift through the debris and search for human remains, and as well as with the Postal Service, who at the same time was going through an anthrax attack, literally all at the same time. So people like Seth really stepped up for the team, and we all pulled together, working 24/7 for what seemed like years, but was months for sure, but a long set of months. And we all came through it together, and the company really launched from there when it comes to emergency management, disaster response, recovery, resilience, as well as sustainability.
Wow, just trial by fire there. What a sobering way to start there. Well, Seth, let's talk about engineers and scientists. We have this idea of working together, but at sometimes at odds too. And what did you guys have in mind when you're talking about these two kind of different hats that you're wearing?
Well, I mean, it was fascinating from the beginning point early on in my career that Tom just mentioned, and it led to other work again, like responding to Hurricane Katrina and the cleanup of that. And then later, with my time at the Clinton Foundation, the response to the earthquakes in Haiti. But after I left that engineering community, I've been involved for the last 12, 15 years in the not-for-profit community, particularly focusing on issues around climate change, sustainability, and urbanization, and work with organizations like the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, a network of megacity mayors tackling climate change, worked with organizations like the Global Covenant of Mayors, and so forth. And in that, we were really looking at working with different levels of government, in this case, particularly cities, where there's a high degree of collaboration and a high degree of political will to tackle the challenges of climate change, particularly it's in a time where most national governments were not really stepping forward and doing things. So after working in that space for, as I mentioned, over a decade and making some real major strides, as the science began to become more understood and implemented in what got finalized at the 2015 Paris Agreement, which President Trump famously pulled us out of when he stepped into office. But that codified 190 plus countries around the world that we wanted to hold to below 2 degrees of warming, that we needed to do something about it. But ever since that point, the conversation, the debate has gone from political and negotiations to, okay, now we need to get something done. And in the last 5 years, we still haven't seen as much action on the ground as we need. And after working in that political environment, and then on the academic side, I was the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's a big famous report on 1.5 degrees. I was very fortunate to have been a lead author on that. So again, on the science and academic community on this, there was still this massive gap in terms of where it's getting implemented. And embarrassingly enough, it was kind of a particularly given my genesis and early days in my career, engineers understand science, they understand politics, they're influential in designing, building, maintaining, and operating the infrastructure and decarbonizing society, but they're not really around. And I think that cues back into conversations and interactions that Tom and I had over, again, that 10-year period.
Well, Tom, let me ask you that too. And from an engineering perspective, when you think about the science and climate science, it seems a lot of it's changing and shifting. I mean, it's pretty consistent in what direction it's going. But when you're talking about infrastructure and you're thinking, we've got to plan out 30, 50, 75 years, and yet this sort of baseline of the science, it is not quite as predictable as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. How does that factor in what you do there at WSP?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it does factor in, because the game is constantly changing on us as engineers in terms of what will conditions be like during the lifespan of a particular element of infrastructure, whether it be a bridge or a port or a building, road, etc. And so you need, as an engineer, to design for that, not just for today's conditions, especially when tomorrow's conditions may be very different. And then to add even more challenge to the situation, you have to still comply with building codes, but often building codes are behind the times and they're slow to change. And so we're bringing that forth at the same time. So there's a lot of moving parts that engineers have to deal with and kind of balance. And also, unfortunately, we also have to deal with the politics. Sometimes Seth mentioned the current administration and their posture on climate change. And, there was one project down in New Orleans where we were raising the levees and building new levees there after Hurricane Katrina. And everyone knew we had to build them higher because of sea level rise, but yet nobody was allowed to say that's why we were doing it. Pure politics. And yet that's the reality of the world that engineers live in oftentimes. And we become good at balancing all those things and not getting pulled down the rabbit hole of all those political discourse, and really just focus on what the infrastructure needs to be, how it needs to perform, how long it needs to last. And as Seth mentioned, how you can do it in a way that is less impactful on the environment, lower carbon footprint, more sustainable.
Okay, Seth, and so as just Tom described what you need to do from an engineering perspective, there's the engineering community in general when you're thinking about infrastructure. How is that kind of, do you have opportunities, I guess, to use Tom as a sounding board? As you're wanting to work with that engineering community. Not everyone necessarily will be on board to sort of kind of make these shifts to thinking about climate change. How does that dynamic work in regards to like how you're trying to create better awareness around this?
Yeah, it's fascinating because in many respects, I think engineers are some of the first and earliest communities of practice that kind of understand this. But because of the constraints that the global environmental engineering community finds itself in, it's not so easy for them to actually speak out because they need to be neutral. They need to be apolitical. They can't get involved oftentimes in the upstream solution or design of the problem, because if they do, it precludes them from bidding on it downstream, which is where they make their money. So if they're conflicted out, they can't be helping design and set forward what they need to do in the first place. So it's a little bit of a conundrum. And I think what's been interesting for my part is I've been engaging with Tom and talking to him. I started bringing Tom to some of the international events that I was doing. And I never forget this. One of the first things that we did of that nature, kind of Tom and I were catching up over beer afterwards. And he said, "That's strange. I didn't see any other engineers here." And I said, "I know. It's policymakers, it's diplomats, it's NGOs, it's philanthropies, no engineers. It's just not a world that they are in. But that world, in terms of what's being designed, implemented, the structures, the policies, the finance mechanisms, engineers aren't there. And they definitely need to be. I mean, they're the ones that are actually going to design and build this stuff. They also know how to do this because of the mistakes that have been made in the past, but they're not at that table. So I think that's where some of that tension and stress has come out that Tom and I have been really focusing on together for the last 5 or 6 years.
And Tom, I want you to elaborate on your experience. You'd mentioned you can't really get political when you're starting to talk about sea level rise, but what I've seen sometimes too is like FEMA will set sea level rise projections, and here's 6 feet. No, it's 4 feet. It's 9 feet. And if you're an engineer dealing with infrastructure, you have to be rolling your eyes. And is the whole sector, are they trying to bake in, I guess, a little bit more? Okay, they're going to come back in 10 years and tell us it needs to even be 2 feet higher. Is any of that sort of going on, that maybe you're baking in more on the higher end just because there's so much, I guess, change in what people are thinking is going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, engineers are taught from year one of engineering school a couple of really fundamental things. One, don't fall prey to false precision, what we call significant digits. We focus on, well, how much do you know and how accurate is what you know? And if the baseline conditions only have a low degree of accuracy, don't then run calculations that go later on downstream in the analysis to a high degree of accuracy. And likewise, we're also taught to put a factor of safety on everything. You learn early on, you don't just design something to be exactly perfect, and that if it goes 1 pound over what you thought it was going to be subjected to in terms of a load, that it's going to fall down. So of course you don't do that, right? So you build in factors of safety. And likewise with costing, when we do cost engineering, we put in what we call contingencies. And so we're used to dealing with a lot of varying levels of unknowns and assumptions, and then making balanced decisions accordingly. So something kind of that just gets built into our DNA as engineers that kind of goes on behind the scenes. A lot of people who aren't engineers probably don't even realize is in there, but trust me, it is. And yeah, we can take into account things like, well, how accurate are these climate models? How accurate are the sea level rise projections? And what level of factor of safety, what contingency do we need to put on that based on what we see as its accuracy, its predictability, its reliability. And so, yeah, especially in the case of climate change, sea level rise, there are a lot of unknowns, many factors that are tough to really get your arms fully around accurately. So yeah, the practice becomes a lot much more of a judgment game. And again, many people may not view it this way, but engineering often is more of an art than a science, because you're balancing all these things. You're taking it all into account. And that's why engineers, do get paid a good living, because they have to balance all these things. And there is a lot of judgment and a lot of kind of responsibility, public safety responsibility that are on all engineers. It's part of our canon of ethics, our code that we all agree to when we become professional engineers. And so, yeah, it's a great profession, as you can probably tell. I'm very passionate about it. I love it. And it is underrated in a lot of circles because they don't realize all the things we have to take into account.
Oh, wow. I don't think I'd ever expect to hear that. Engineering's more of an art than a science. I love that. That's a good expression there. Seth, I want to get into some of these other topics here, and let's talk about sustainability versus resilience. And we chatted a little bit about this, and sustainability has been a concept that's been actually around for decades now. A lot of businesses, you have a sustainability officer, and more recently, adaptation resilience has come up. And there's, I don't think enough people have put some thought of is there a lot of overlap? Are these two separate areas? Some people might think, well, sustainability, we've got that covered. What are your thoughts? You're there at the resilience shift. Do you feel like these are kind of two separate universes, or is it just one and the same?
Well, it's a little of both. I think in many cases, it is still a little bit separate universes. Of course, the answer is that they're absolutely interrelated and connected, and really shouldn't be kept separate or siloed. So that in the broader respect, that's my simple answer. I think, of course, some of the other things that are going on is that there's been a tremendous amount of work over the last 20, 30 years in terms of sustainability, its uptake, its understanding, its education, its capacity building, triple bottom line. And you've got entire businesses and communities of practice built around that. That's a good thing. But the problem is that also people get wedded to that, and people get a little tired. There's always something new. And being so steeped in this kind of space, I absolutely decidedly remember when kind of resilience came onto the scene. And it was a little bit of an eye roll, like, here we go. Let's just rename something and retag something to make it kind of interesting and or to try to generate funding or business opportunities. Of course, that was in the early days, and now resilience is in and of its own right incredibly important and while connected, still very much different. But I'm really excited about it because it provides a more holistic framing, I think, in many ways for what needs to happen and for how we think about the world that we're moving into and inhabitating. So Tom just mentioned, of course, the engineering perspective and a factor of safety, which is quite interesting, and it is a major premise that the engineering community is built on. But at the same time, we're currently experiencing, as a kind of a human species, global society, an unprecedented level of change. The amount of uncertainty that we have now and are being faced with has never been felt. I mean, climate change is fundamentally changing the consistency with which the climate operates. Well, that's why we've excelled as a human species, because we have a very stable climate over centuries, thousands of years, and now that's changing. At the same time, the rate of urbanization of people moving from rural to urban communities is accelerating. It's the largest migration that's happening in the world, and it's human beings moving from rural to urban areas. And then we've got the fourth industrial revolution, technological change. You put all that together, the level of uncertainty is profound. And yet we're still asking engineers to cope with this in the same way that they have over the last 50 years without speeding up the tools with which they have to do it. So if you think about resilience in that context, what are we doing to order our society to have the future, the safety, the health and the wealth that we want moving forward? And there's a lot of different things. Just as Tom was saying, engineers need to balance. There's a lot of things as a society we need to balance in terms of trade-offs, pros and cons, in order to adapt, respond, and to thrive in this century.
And Tom, I want you to take a crack at that question. And just, I imagine from the perspective, you're at WSP, which I'm sure has a long history of sustainability within the culture of the business, but then resilience, adaptation, this emerging issue, which you've developed quite a lot of expertise around. And so you've had, in one company, you've had both kind of come up. What's your experience been with those two topics?
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's a great question and a timely one, because this is a dialogue that's going on within WSP right now. And WSP, although engineers are at our core, we also have many scientists, planners, architects, economists, just advisory, management consultants, people who also bring different perspectives. So we're almost like a microcosm of what Seth was describing as well. And so everyone views it a little differently in terms of, well, is resilience different than sustainability or not? Are they related or not? And my answer to that is, yes, they're different, but they're not separate, and they are synergistic. And they to be successful, if you're trying to bring sustainable, resilient solutions to your clients, which is our job here at WSP, you have to be considering both. and also be considering the future. Our phrase for it is future ready. You need to first be future ready yourselves as a company. So we have training within WSP on that. Then you turn to the clients and try to educate them as well on being future ready. Because as Seth said, the rate of change is exponentially increasing. And so there are so many more degrees of freedom and other potential options. There's not many bright lines anymore. When you start to look at that rapidly changing world and you project out 30 to 50 years, it's really subject to a lot of interpretation and judgment. And that's where diversity and inclusion comes in big, which is also very important to us as a company. But I think it's very important to doing a good job with these kinds of challenges, because if you just have singular thought, you just have a bunch of engineers in a room, you won't get anywhere near the broad thinking, the brainstorming, the kinds of out-of-the-box solutions that you get if you bring in the economists, the scientists, the architects as well, and also different perspectives globally. WSP is a global company, and so we think of sustainability and typical solutions here in the U.S. maybe as things like green roofs or permeable pavements. And Seth and I were part of a session a year ago, when, right as ICSI was kicking off our coalition, and Deborah Roberts, who's from South Africa, said, you all talk about these solutions like green roofs and permeable pavements. Places in Africa don't even have pavements. They barely have buildings. But they need sustainability and resilience as well. So you've got that whole geographic developing nation versus developed nation challenge as well, if you're a global company like WSP. So it's fascinating, it's challenging, and it really does take a true team with lots of different perspectives, and including all those perspectives to really come up with the best solutions.
Well, I agree. There's certainly lots of overlap in what they're doing, but my experience even with adaptation, maybe sustainability doesn't even kind of come into it. If you sort of approach the sustainability officer saying to Miami is going to have to deal with 9 feet of sea level rise, or 6 feet, or 5 feet. How do you do that in a sustainable way? And it's almost a ridiculous question, right? And so it kind of takes you in a different direction. So I think we're still having that conversation. But on that note, we're actually getting toward the end of the episode, and what I definitely want to make some time for, and maybe Seth, you can take a first crack, is that this group that you guys founded, the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. What is it, and what are you trying to accomplish with that?
Well, just to Tom's point, I mean, engineers at the heart of a lot of this, but it's not their duty or responsibility alone, and it does take a vast and radical collaboration to tackle the challenges in the time frame that we have left. And when Tom and I were talking more about this, we were kind of struck with the fact that there needed to be more of a vehicle and a catalyst to allow engineers, and again, lots of different types of engineers, as Tom alluded to. There's engineering associations, there's companies, there's academia. So that broad spectrum of engineering and engineers needed, we thought, a vehicle to pull that together across that value chain to really kind of congeal the global community and plug them in to all of these other things that are happening with policymakers, economists, particularly around intergovernmental negotiations, the nationally determined contributions on each country is going to start tackling decarbonization by mid-century. And most importantly, making sure that when we do that over the next decade, which is what the science tells us needs to happen, we have 10 years to decarbonize. We need to make sure that investment, that those solutions that we provide do not entrench us into another high carbon scenario. So they've got to be resilient. But if we spend all that money on low carbon infrastructure without adequately planning the resilience and the adapted capacity that they need to have for the future that we're entering, those will be this century's stranded assets. And we'll have to tear them right out and redo it again. We don't have enough time or money to do that. So that was the premise and the idea in terms of creating a coalition with different organizations, different networks, and pre-existing coalitions in order to harness the power and the focus and the collaboration of the engineering community to link them to these other communities of practice.
And Tom, could you just maybe elaborate a bit further? Like, what are some of the things that you're hoping to do? I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but this coalition, what's sort of next for it?
Yeah, I think a few different things to build on what Seth said. One, he mentioned earlier that engineers often tend to hang back until the downstream end of the process so they can just design whatever everyone else decides they want to have built. So what we want to do is push the engineers upstream, get them in the center of these policy discussions, of the discussions early on, even before you start talking about funding and whether you want to build something like this or something like that. Because really, an engineer can design a sustainable, resilient design for any assumed project you give us. But what if that project that you give us is not the right project? What if doing something completely different, or doing it in a completely different place, would be more resilient, would be more sustainable? And if the engineers hang back and they don't get in that upstream conversation, they can do nothing other than deal with what they're given and try to make that thing as resilient or as sustainable as it could be. But if they had only been involved earlier, they could have put it in a whole different direction, thought in a different way, and be orders of magnitude more resilient, more sustainable, and like Seth said, avoid the needing to tear it out in 10, 15 years because what was designed really wasn't well chosen in terms of what you thought you needed 15 years ago. Now all of a sudden, because conditions have changed so much, so fast, you need something completely different. So it's really about putting the engineers upstream and also being action oriented. Engineers can write a report with the best of the professionals, but what we really like to do is get stuff done. That's what drives us. We love to see something get built. And can't say necessarily always the same with economists or scientists. And that's not a criticism. That's not what they're trained to do. They're actually trained to just assess and project and model. Engineers are trained to build stuff, get stuff done. And so because we're running out of time in the climate change challenge, and we really do need to think about not just mitigation of the greenhouse gas emissions, because the balance is tipping. We all know that. So now we have to look at, well, if the balance tips too much, how are we going to adapt? How are we going to mitigate? How are we going to still be resilient and sustainable as possible? And engineers are uniquely suited to take that on and be a critical part of that dialogue and decision-making process.
Okay, gentlemen, we need to wrap this up. This has been a fascinating conversation, and just, I think you've created the coalition partly just you can keep working together, so that's a good thing too, right? I mean,
I missed them so much. You're right.
It's like, how do we work together? Let's create a coalition, and we'll have all these other benefits. That's fabulous. All right, if we could just really quickly, sort of, what's next for you two? I mean, again, are you guys even sort of being able to kind of see each other in person and some of this work-related stuff, or is it just COVID buffer for the foreseeable future? But I mean, like, kind of what's next for you two? Seth, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, well, it's definitely virtual, and for somebody who spent a good amount of the last decade traveling around the world, it's been actually pretty nice to just stay home. And talking to a lot of other colleagues in the same space, I think part of COVID is the realization that we don't need to do the same level of traveling that we did before, and we can get a lot done through the technical infrastructure that we're using now to kind of continue to move things forward. What's on next for Tom and I, we've got actually a 1-year anniversary coming up from the creation of the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, which we kicked off in the city of LA. So we're having a summit, a virtual symposium in mid-November. So please go to the website. You're free to attend if you'd like to. So we're excited about that, providing some updates on the progress that we've made. And I should also mention, Tom and I have had a phenomenal time working together, and hopefully will continue to do so. There's a lot of other people involved. So the American Society for Civil Engineers is one of the founding partners of this, as is the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which is a network of 10,000 cities around the world. So we've got some other major partners and collaborators that are helping enable all of this.
Excellent. And Tom, any final thoughts regarding what's ahead?
Yeah, well, first, I'm with Seth. I didn't think so because I love to travel. And actually, my wife would travel with me sometimes, and we enjoyed that very much. But I will say, like Seth, it's been nice to reconnect at home, be home for literally months on end, and just feel not just even connected to the family more, but even the community where I live. And that's been very nice. Having said that, yeah, I do look forward to getting past the pandemic and being out there, because I do think to maximize the potential of this international coalition for sustainable infrastructure, we've got to get the word out. We've got to be in many places, including the global south, where they need solutions as much as anybody, but they can't necessarily afford to do that and pay for a consultant to come in. And that's one of the things our coalition is looking at, is providing those kinds of resources through the Global Covenant of Mayors and their network. And it's exciting, really exciting stuff, really meaningful work. And it will be hampered if we can't at some point soon get back out there and go to the places, see the places, meet the people, hear their needs, and then hopefully address their needs. So I look forward to that day, hopefully in the not too distant future.
All right, gentlemen, this has been fantastic. I want to transition into just chatting, but we're going to end the episode here. But thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having us, Doug.
All right, so just hold on one sec. We're going to transition to just chatting.